Good morning, and thank you all for attending today's event. My name is Corporal Brent Miller, and I'm the Director of the Communications Office with the Pennsylvania State Police. We are here today at the Municipal Police Officers Education and Training Commission, referred to as MOPEC, to discuss the launch of the new MOPEC database that will hold the separation records of all Pennsylvania law enforcement officers who leave employment with an agency. Our speakers today will begin with Governor Tom Wolf, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Paris, Deputy Commissioner of Administration and Professional Responsibility with the Pennsylvania State Police. Then, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro, Commissioner Michael Muldrow of the York City Police Department, State Representative Chris Rabb, Senator Sharif Street, and finally, State Representative Donna Bullock. We will then open the floor for questions. And now, I'd like to turn the podium over to Governor Wolf.
Thank you, Brent, and thank you all for being here, and thank all of you for being here. I don't have to say public safety is a huge priority for everybody in public service, and what we're talking about here, the reforms that we've produced are going to make us safer, the whole community, and I think make things better for all of us, including the folks behind me and the folks who serve us in public safety. Last year, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of community leaders, advocates, law enforcement officials, and state and local leaders about how we can improve policing to better meet the needs of our communities while reducing misconduct. And this is important. We're trying to balance this, make sure that we're serving our communities in every possible way. Reducing misconduct that makes policing more dangerous both for the public and for our public safety officers. Following those conversations, I took strong executive action to improve policing in the Commonwealth. I created a Law Enforcement Citizen Advisory Commission. I established a new Deputy Inspector General inside the administration focused on deterring fraud, waste, misconduct, abuse among law enforcement agencies under the governor's jurisdiction. And there are a number of law enforcement officials under my direction. And I called for updated training standards and improved mental health support for officers. I was also proud to sign 2 bipartisan law enforcement reform bills into law last July. One that further improves mental health supports for law enforcement officers, and one that helps track past misconduct among officers. Today we mark the next step in implementing the reforms included in Act 57 of last year, 2020. And that's the creation of a database for separation records to track misconduct by peace officers in the Commonwealth, wherever they are. For the past year, MOPEC, right back here, has been preparing the database. And as of Wednesday of this week, 2 days ago, it is in use all across Pennsylvania. And that means that whenever an officer leaves a law enforcement agency for any reason, a form will be submitted to this database. And if any misconduct is present in that officer's record, that misconduct will be flagged. It'll be documented in the data. When law enforcement agencies hire new officers, they're going to be required to check that database for past separation records. And if they choose to hire someone who has had a record of past misconduct, the hiring agency must submit a form explaining the decision, and that hiring report will be subject to right to know. It's a higher level, a higher standard for public servants. This is an important tool for our law enforcement agencies. It's going to help agencies identify potential red flags in candidates, which helps agencies invest in better employees that they're going to want to train and they're going to want to retain. It's going to improve transparency in hiring for law enforcement agencies and for anybody who is looking into those agencies. And it's going to help keep officers with a history of misconduct away from roles where they can cause further harm. This is an important step toward better law enforcement in Pennsylvania, but there's much more that we need to do. This is a really important step, but we got to remember it's a first step. And I'm going to continue to push for changes that we need to make our Commonwealth safer for every single Pennsylvanian. Thank you. And now I am proud to turn this over to Lieutenant Colonel Paris, State Police. Lieutenant Colonel.
Thank you, Governor Wolf, for the introduction. I also want to thank Pennsylvania Attorney General Shapiro, legislators, MOPEC staff, and commission members, and other distinguished guests. We're here today at the Municipal Police Officers Education and Training Commission, otherwise known as MOPEC, which was created in 1974 to establish certification and training standards for municipal police officers across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It consists of 20 members appointed by the governor. On July 14th, 2020, Governor Wolf signed Act 57 into law, which requires law enforcement agencies to conduct a thorough background investigation on anyone applying for employment as a law enforcement officer, or for a position leading to employment as a law enforcement officer. The act also required the creation of a database that will be used to augment the enhanced background investigation process for the hiring of law enforcement officers. Additionally, for the first time in the state's history, law enforcement agencies are required to maintain and provide all employment records, including performance evaluations and reasons for separation pertaining to a previously employed law enforcement officer to a prospective hiring agency. The Act also requires law enforcement agencies to maintain separation records that include the reason or reasons for and circumstances surrounding a separation of service for a law enforcement officer, all criminal charges filed against a law enforcement officer, all civil and ethical complaints made against a law enforcement officer, and any final and binding disciplinary actions against a law enforcement officer for the following reasons: excessive force, sexual abuse, filing a false report, harassment, sexual misconduct, a judicial finding of dishonesty, theft, domestic violence, discrimination, or coercion of a false confession. I'm pleased to announce that on Wednesday, July 14th, 2021, MOPEC launched the electronic law enforcement separation database housed in our training and certification system, our TAX system. The database was required to be operational by July 14th, and we promulgated temporary regulations by March 14th. They were published on March 6th with an effective date of this past Wednesday. The development of permanent regulations will occur over the next year in accordance with a Regulatory Review Act review, and they're required to be completed by March of 2023. During this time, MOPEC will seek input and feedback from stakeholders and the public. In addition, MOPEC will also use this time, moving forward, to test and refine the database and associated regulations to ensure compliance in carrying out the purposes of Act 57. There are more than 22,000 municipal police officers and more than 4,500 troopers protecting the citizens of and the visitors to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The database will service more than 1,300 agencies and house approximately 30,000 to 35,000 officers. I would like to thank the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Mansfield University Police Department, and Mifflin County Sheriff's Office for their participation during the testing phase of the database. I also want to personally thank all of the MOPEC commissioners, staff, and attorneys, IT personnel, and employees of the Pennsylvania State Police who worked tirelessly in that period from last year to this to ensure that the temporary regulations and database were completed on time and on schedule. Law enforcement officers are held to a higher standard of professionalism. Residents expect that the officers who respond to their calls for help will be good, honest stewards of the Commonwealth. The database announced here today will help eliminate problematic officers being employed in law enforcement and serving in our communities. And now I'd like to turn it over to Attorney General Josh Shapiro.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to acknowledge and thank the women and men behind me for their good work. They've all been mentioned, but for Representative Williams, I want to thank him for his leadership as well. And while Representative Bullock was recognized and no doubt does a great job for the good people of North Philadelphia, she's also here in her capacity as the leader of the Legislative Black Caucus, who are so critical to these conversations we are having about police reform. And I want to thank her for her leadership as well. Governor Wolf set the table for progress here in Pennsylvania, and today is an example of that progress that we are making. I also want to thank the thousands of women and men who don the police uniform each and every day across Pennsylvania. I know you personally shoulder the burden that a lack of trust in law enforcement and a lack of support for law enforcement can create. I also know that you want to improve the trust between law enforcement and the community. And you do not want to serve alongside people who are unfit to serve and wear that uniform. I want to thank you for your service, for keeping our community safe, and for demonstrating the compassion, bravery, and respect that Pennsylvanians rightfully expect from us. 1 year ago, our Commonwealth became the first state with a divided government to take real legislative action after the murder of George Floyd. We all know that Pennsylvania is a big and diverse state with millions of people with their own beliefs and backgrounds and experiences. And I think we all recognize that finding common ground is a hard thing to do. But we all sat down in the same room, law enforcement, activists, legislators, people from both sides of the aisle, because we all understood and agreed that every single community in Pennsylvania should feel safe, and that no community should fear those who were sworn to protect them. We heard and saw the righteous calls for justice, those marching in peace and asking for progress. And despite the narrative that nothing gets done and that there's no compromise, we together delivered a meaningful step forward. Because of that work, law enforcement agencies in our state now have access to the misconduct and disciplinary records of any Pennsylvania officer that they're seeking to hire for the first time. This is something that chiefs have been asking for. The community has demanded. Lawmakers like Representative Rabb have pushed for. And now that database is up and running. This will help us build up that trust between law enforcement and the community that we serve, which is critical for local police officers to do their job. It will help our officers feel trusted and valued, and it will help our communities feel safe. We can and must accomplish both in Pennsylvania. I believe this database will save lives. But I also know and recognize, as the governor indicated, that this database is really just a down payment. It's one of the many steps that we need to take to ensure justice and real safety for all Pennsylvanians. In the Office of Attorney General, we've taken many of those steps, from updating our policies according to the 8 can't wait call to action, and incorporating de-escalation to having more diversity in our agent leadership more than ever before. But we know we need to take more steps. That's why I'm committed as the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, our Chief Law Enforcement Officer, to creating space where everyone is at the table again, so that we can have honest discussions about how we can keep moving forward on our shared priorities. Like, how do we get more good officers and people who can stop violence on our streets and keep people unfit from serving in this noble profession out of our ranks? And hear me on this. We need real accountability for officers who violate their duty to serve and protect. As a group, look, we may disagree on the questions of how to accomplish these goals, but I think we all recognize the need to continue to work on these changes, and that any solution needs to answer a few basic questions. Is the community asking for this change? Will it make our neighborhoods feel safer? And does it solve a shortcoming here in Pennsylvania? This registry that launched this week in Pennsylvania passed that basic test. And I know that the work we must continue to do will pass that test as well. Look, we owe it to ourselves and to every single family in Pennsylvania to work towards solutions that make us truly safer and truly achieve the cause of justice for all. I'm grateful that everyone is here today to commemorate this work. And now it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to the Commissioner of the York County Police Department, someone who's on the front lines and recognizes just how critical this database will be. Commissioner?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Muldrow. I'm proudly the Commissioner of the York City Police Department. Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited for the opportunity to speak on behalf of municipal law enforcement. I proudly stand before you today as the son of a cop, as a person who's dedicated the last 20+ years of my life to service and policing. I come to you today representing the thousands of amazing individuals across Pennsylvania who put on that uniform each and every day and come to work for the right reasons, selflessly taking up arms in defense of others. And I say, without hesitation, without reservation, and without pause, change is okay, change is a good thing, and change is necessary. Everything needs to be able to grow, to evolve, to change. We're not perfect. We recognize we have a few bad apples in our bunch. And contrary to what is oftentimes portrayed or believed about police, I think I speak for all of us when I say we want our bad apples out too. Those individuals who tarnish the image of our chosen profession, tainting the good we try to do, swaying new people and new talent away from the noble life of service that is policing. So to Governor Wolf, our legislators, and the commission, I commend you. I commend you for taking the first steps with the changes found in Act 57, the new database and the reporting requirements that come with it. It will undoubtedly help to fill in some of those cracks that individuals have been able to slip through thus far. And to my colleagues in law enforcement, let's keep it going. Let's continue to do our part, embracing, promoting, and pursuing positive change. Not because we have to or that we're waiting to be forced to do it, but because we see opportunities to grow and make change, and because it's the right thing to do. Change in how we recruit, in how we approach the job, how we coach our people, in the goals that we set, the expectations and priorities that we have for one another. Change that will empower our people to take things just a little slower on the call, remaining cautious and safe, while valuing care and concern as much as compliance. Change that will teach young officers to do things that they should, not because they can. Change that will help make sure those few bad apples don't just continue to roll around from department to department, poisoning our supply and our reputation. Change that will once again motivate that little boy and girl to tell their teacher, I want to grow up to be a police officer. Because the truth is, there's so much good work being done around the state by the brave women and men who do this job and wear this uniform. So much intentional effort being put forth every day, trying to become a department or departments that reflect the neighborhoods we serve, trying to become empathetic, service-oriented agencies our customers want to see at their front door, all while continuing to fight to keep our community safe. So we want the community to know that while it may look a little different, we've always been a profession that's evolving, full of people worth supporting, and we're embracing opportunities to get better. We're embracing those changes because we know you entrust us with awesome responsibility every time we raise our hands and swear an oath to serve and protect you. We wouldn't be here without you. We remember and respect the fact that we represent you. And while dedicated to earning and honoring the trust that you have in us, continuing to be our best selves, something you, our families, and future generations of police officers can continue to be proud of. So with that, I appreciate the work that had been done. I thank you for having me today, and I would like to introduce Representative Rabb. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Governor Wolf, Attorney General Shapiro, my colleagues in the legislature, my colleagues in law enforcement, it's an honor to be here today. Just months after the tragic murder of Antoine Rose in 2018, I introduced an interdepartmental police hiring reform bill. After a major rally for police accountability in the state capitol in 2019, I reintroduced it. This time it was referred to the House Judiciary Committee, where it languished. In the fall of 2019, Attorney General Josh Shapiro convened a meeting with the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus and various stakeholders from law enforcement, where he stated that legislation to create a police misconduct database represented one of the lowest hanging fruit for all parties to support. Fast forward to last summer, where peaceful protests in the wake of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were organized all across our Commonwealth. That passionate, urgent expression of the collective will of justice-loving Americans from a panoply of backgrounds sparked a historic, nonviolent, direct action among a handful of state reps that led a Republican-controlled General Assembly to unanimously pass 2 Democratic bills, merged from 4 separate pieces of legislation that had not received any previous attention in the General Assembly. Act 57 of 2020 was signed into law just 36 days after this successful act of civil disobedience on the House floor was orchestrated, as inspired by Black Lives Matter movement, itself rising from the deep inequities in policing that festered in Ferguson and nationwide for generations. But in this moment, I stand here with this prediction: that with bolstered transparency measures adopted through the regulatory process, appropriate resources, and administrative rigor, this state interdepartmental law enforcement misconduct database has the potential to both identify and ultimately reduce the number of law enforcement agency applicants who are hired despite having egregious documented disciplinary actions against them that endanger community well-being. But as much as this enactment and activation of Act 57 and the database it created are worthy of celebration, this statute is only as good as the sunlight it shines on once opaque processes. At best, this database will be populated with broad and relevant hiring information to allow law enforcement employers to know before a candidate is hired if that person will be an asset or a liability to their agency and to the public at large. It should also mitigate the likelihood a police force knowingly offers a badge and a gun to the next Michael Rosfeld or Ryan Pownall. But Act 57 addresses the worst symptoms of a 321-year-old institution. Other legislation yet passed address deeper systemic issues that our chairwoman, Donna Bullock, is leading the fight on. And the fight is ongoing. Yes, this database represents a bold and historic accomplishment, but it is just the beginning. And it is no secret that Black and brown and justice-loving people of all backgrounds will not rest until we reinvent what community safety looks like in our Commonwealth. Why? Because we know that when the beloved community rises in the streets for justice, we catch a glimpse of what greatness can look like. We will not rest until this just transformation becomes final and binding in the moral fabric of our Commonwealth. I now would like to introduce my colleague in the State Senate, Senator Sharif Street.
Thank you, Representative Rabb, members of law enforcement. General Shapiro, and of course Governor Wolf. Well, we thank each of you for being here. To my other colleagues in the General Assembly, Representative Williams and Chairwoman Bullock, I also thank you for your work in this regard. Communities want to feel safe. When there are challenges that confront them, they want to be able to call on the police for assistance and feel confident that the officer that is responding will offer more help and not create problems. The vast and overwhelming majority of officers want to answer that call. It is a fundamental part of the contract that allows our society to survive. The idea that when there are problems, we don't engage in vigilantism or self-help, but we reach out to law enforcement, and that law enforcement will respond in an appropriate and reasonable way with all diligence to be helpful. And most of the time it works that way. But the few officers who betray that confidence and who undermine that trust put at risk the entire system. Those officers who betray the public trust and who act inappropriately, sometimes causing the loss of life and many times causing the loss of trust, not only damage the communities that they are impacting, but damage and negatively impact the other men and women who are sworn to serve as they have sworn to serve. This database is an important step on a long journey towards reinforcing in the public's mind that that contract is going to be honored by our government, that the men and women who wear a badge, take an oath to be law enforcement officers, to keep the peace and uphold the law, will in fact do that. We want them to do that without regard to race or class, without regard to national origin or gender identity or sexual orientation or religion. We want them to be fair, and most of them want to do the same thing. And when a police department is making hiring decisions about some of the personnel who have the greatest impact on the quality of life and the public's trust in government, they need to have at their disposal the best information. And no one should be able to go from one department where you break that compact of trust to another department and not have the hiring officials at the new department have the appropriate data in evaluating their decisions. It's important, and it's an important step. But the Native American proverb that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. We've taken a step. There are other things we still need to do. We're at MOPEC, and MOPEC will maintain the database, but we need to make sure that MOPEC's use of force standards, which they routinely create and update, are adopted by every law enforcement agency. I had legislation to move and have those standards be adopted by every police department in the Commonwealth, and indeed passed the Senate. We need a little help in the House getting it through next time. And I ask my colleagues in the Senate to make sure we take up that legislation again. And there are other components of this overall process in these package of bills that move forward. But today we stand here to acknowledge an important step in that process, making sure that we have a database so that information can be available to hiring officials. And we make a down payment on a bond of trust between members of the General Assembly, the Commonwealth, our police departments, and the public we serve. And so we acknowledge that step, and we celebrate it in some way, acknowledging that we have a lot of work to do. I'll now introduce a person who is leading the way and making sure that we continue to address so many of those issues, who speaks to the issues of individuals in her district, but also a broad array of people across the Commonwealth, and a special place in my heart because she makes, as the chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus, is committed to making sure that young black men like my 3 sons are safe walking around every part of this Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, present to some and introduce to others the chairwoman of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus and a tireless champion of justice, the Honorable Representative Donna Bullock.
Thank you, Senator Street, and thank you to our Governor, Attorney General, the Corporal, Lieutenant, Commissioner, and all of our men and women who serve in law enforcement, and of course my colleagues in the General Assembly, Senator Street, Representative Chris Rabb, and Representative Dan Williams. In 2019, I had the opportunity to stand next to Michelle Kenny, the mother of Antoine Rose, a 17-year-old who was fatally shot by a police officer just sworn in a few moments before that fatal incident. And as I stood next to her in the Capitol and she made her plea for police reform, I felt her grief. Her grief was palpable, and as a mother of 2 sons, it was inescapable for me. But I also understood the assignment. I understood that she had charged us that day to go back on the House floor and the Senate floor, to go back into our offices and our communities, and to do all that we can to hold police accountable, to make hiring in law enforcement as transparent as possible, and to do everything we possibly could to ensure that not another mother carries that grief. I understood that assignment. Representative Rabb, Representative Williams, Senator Street, and many of the other members of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus understood that assignment. We went back and we looked at legislation that many of us had already introduced, and we took inventory and we said, how can we and what can we accomplish? What legislation made sense? What legislation could we get buy-in and from stakeholders across the Commonwealth, from law enforcement agencies across the Commonwealth, from our colleagues across the aisle? And this bill was one of those. And we continued to work on that legislation because I understood, Commissioner, that we didn't want to have these bad apples in our communities. You see, Commissioner, because when I get on a plane, I don't expect the airline to tell me they have a few bad apples on the flight crew. Or when I go to the emergency room, I don't expect the doctors to tell me there's a few bad apples working in the emergency room that day. And so the citizens of Pennsylvania do not expect from their law enforcement to have a few bad apples serving their communities. We have a responsibility to ensure that. We had an assignment from a mother to ensure that. This database gets a check mark. We got one thing done on that assignment. This database is a step forward on all of the police reform efforts that my colleagues in the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus and our police reform working group has been working on. This database is some assurance for mothers like Michelle Kenny and myself and others that we are doing all we can to have a professional police department, a trustworthy police department, an ethical police department, and one that is rid of bad apples. I want to thank everyone who stepped up, whether you stepped into this process years before I got involved, or in 2018 and 19, or last year when our Commonwealth responded to the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and decided this was the moment. This was the moment to get real police reform done. And this database is evidence of that work. So thank you again. And now I'd like to turn the mic back over to our governor, Governor Tom Wolf.
So, thank you, Donna. Any questions? Yes.
I do have a question. Last year, in the wake of George Floyd's death, when we started talking about the police misconduct, record and it being open to police departments, is this now going to be open to the public, reporters, community stakeholders, so that they also have access to these files when we're looking at police misconduct?
I'm going to let Chris Rabb talk about the details, but the key here is if somebody, these are personnel records, if somebody in a police department in some municipality decides to ignore something that is not right in someone's record in the database, then that has a right. That is open to right to know.
It's open to a right to know. You have to file right to know.
You have to. It is automatically. Chris, did I miss?
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. In my original bill, there was full transparency to the public. We negotiated something that allowed for, first and foremost, we wanted to make sure that the folks who were hiring weren't flying blind. You want to know that you're hiring an asset and not a liability, and there was no way for chiefs of police to do that in good faith and know that they're bringing on someone who they could be proud of. Their hands were tied. That's why we had such strong support from law enforcement, because that opened it up. But as it relates to your question with regard to the general public, the only information that's available to the general public is a hiring report. And the hiring report is triggered if there is someone who hires someone with the red flag. And the red flag is one of the 10 enumerated disciplinary actions that was mentioned. However, it's only if it's final and binding. So if you have an insurrectionist who gets outed by an investigative reporter and they leave before there's disciplinary action and they take a job at another police agency, there's no public transparency for that. It's nothing the public can find out on its own. And that's something that we can address through the regulatory process. But the hiring report is essential. What we hope, and I'm sure law enforcement agrees with me, is that we file as few hiring reports as possible, because there won't be chiefs of police, state troopers, et cetera, who would want to hire anyone with the red flag. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can someone shed light on how common it is for officers to move to a different state, in the normal career path, and whether it's a shortcoming that this is apparently a database of only Pennsylvania officers and incidents?
Yeah, let me turn that over to somebody who can.
The database as currently set up will only involve Pennsylvania agencies. The framework that was offered by the legislation is compliant with the database. To address your position, if I'm understanding it correctly, if you had somebody who was potentially employed in another state jurisdiction and thus sought employment in Pennsylvania, the best way that would be mitigated, as in all of hiring, would be through a thorough background investigation. And we need to reinforce that and support that to the best that we can through those 1,300 agencies.
Is it common in the normal career path? Do police officers move around much?
I would be remiss to give you a number. I don't know necessarily. I could speak to the Pennsylvania State Police. We do have a fair number of individuals who were prior municipal law enforcement prior to becoming troopers, and our background process would address that. There's a waiver that's signed through our background process whereby the applicant allows us to do essentially what this bill mandates, which is to go to those prior employers and seek what the personnel file and records show, in addition to the in-person interviews that we would conduct. But I can direct you to somebody in MOPEC, maybe they have some additional numbers in terms of municipal officers who...
Yeah, I would just add that, I would just add that, look, it was... It's not merely people who naturally move from place to place. No one is suggesting that the average officer is a problem. What we're suggesting is that there are a particular classification of class of officers who, because they know that they are bad actors, intentionally move from place to place because departments are seeking to weed them out, and that we want to make sure hiring officials in the new departments don't receive them unwittingly. And so it's not as if it's merely a chance of what is the behavior of the overall population of officers that needs to be regulated. This is targeted at bad actors who wish to evade responsibility by moving from department to department. And specifically, we know in the case of Antoine Rose, he was hired by the officer that was hired that took his life, had been fired by another police department in the same county mere weeks before his death.
Are there standards for what the definition is of a red flag versus what's just maybe a normal infraction? Because
Yes, that's in the legislation. I think you enumerated that.
is that something that automatically pops up when the chief would perhaps search the system for a new hire? Or would they have to seek that out and go through all the records?
So when I mentioned the numbers of profiles in the database, every law enforcement officer that's entered into the database has a profile. The system is now operational as of Wednesday. When there's a separation, and that could not necessarily be a separation for disciplinary purposes, but any separation, retirement or resignation to move on to a different job, the police agency is required to submit a form that essentially seeks to delineate if one of those 10 infractions are viable, and then that would exist in the database moving forward.
Is that something that's easy to identify in the database for chiefs so they can see it right away that one of those?
The chiefs, it's a red flag database. So if we get the report, it will be in the database. Any prospective agency that's seeking to hire somebody, they will be required to submit the prospective applicant through the database, and thus the red flag will be. It's going to be a all but real-time notification.
Just one more question for you. How many years of information do you think this database can hold? And number two, what's the security around it if any officer is worried about their privacy?
Two good IT questions. I mean, the database is not open to the public. It will be protected by the same IT infrastructure that protects all of our databases within the state police. There's no system that's obviously 100% secure, but in today's day and age, cybersecurity is one of our top priorities. And how long the data will actually, the actual memory essentially that you're asking for, I can get you that number. It's been built robustly under this existing system to try and obviously do things fiscally conservatively in compliance with the regulation, and we believe it has the capacity that it needs. But I can get you a straight answer on that. Corporal Miller will follow that up for us.
Thank you. Anything else? Yes.
How will this help current department heads with their current officers? So these are not officers who are seeking new employment but are currently on staff. When they are uploading their conduct, how does this help them maybe discipline, weed out, make better police forces for current chiefs?
This is to be used in the hiring process.
Only in the hiring process,
I think
so it's not really
that's right. Yeah. Yes.
The database is only moving forward, so if I leave the
Well,
department,
in the hiring process, yes.
so an officer who had misconduct in the past and was fired is not going to show up in the database. Is that accurate?
This only really shows up during the hiring process. That's right. So it's prospective.
So can you speak to why that? Why did you not look back or seek to look backward?
Are you familiar with sausage? We had to start somewhere. And through the legislative process, this is where we are. But the beauty here is, though, that, I mean, look at where we are. This is us working together saying, okay, we're starting a pretty bold step. This is not something that other states have in this political environment. It's really significant. So we're starting where we are, and we're improving along the way. I would like this to be retroactive as well. I would. But here's the other thing. If you're one of these folks who really tarnish the badge, you have the capacity, you're going to be thinking, oh, well, if I leave here, I'm going to show up on a database, right? So now there's a level of accountability so that you don't do anything wrong going forward, because let's be honest, and law enforcement can tell you this, like, we're talking about the worst of the worst here. To your question, the 10 things that are enumerated, it's not any random minor thing. We're talking about sexual abuse, excessive force, theft, domestic violence. These are things that all law enforcement say are unacceptable, right? So if you've done any of that stuff in the past, and you're still on the force, you might be doing some of that going forward, and if you get caught, you're going to show up in that database. So this should have a chilling effect on those folks who are still in the system.
Commissioner.
Thank you again. I just wanted to kind of speak to the same point. When this took effect, when I got the call about coming here today, and I can tell you because my training lieutenant is actually, he accompanied me to, here, it instantly,
Who's that?
Lieutenant Lentz, if you can throw him a wave over there for me, it instantly made us all take pause. It instantly made us think. Literally in my department, as we sat down as a command staff, it immediately made us step it up. It immediately made us care a little bit more. What he's saying is so powerful when you actually look at it. From Wednesday on, all of us, any of us that choose to move on, whether we retire, whether it's a matter of termination, whether you're thinking you see the bad things to come and you're trying to flash jump somewhere else, it made you instantly have to consider, what did I do for the last 5 years? What does my record look like for the last 5 years? What did I get involved in? What didn't I get involved in? Because now, forevermore, it's going to travel with you. That's powerful. I mean, and that's something that's powerful today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good job. Any other questions? Not? Thank you very much. Thank you.